EdTech Live is sponsored by LiveKiosk.com, the $49 solution which turns used computers into no-maintenance web stations for classrooms and libraries. LiveKiosk.com.
Hi, this is Steve Hargadon. Welcome to EdTech Live. Tonight is Thursday, September 28th, and my guest is Doc Searls, Senior Editor of Linux Journal and the co-author of the Clue Train Manifesto. Welcome, Doc.
Hey, good to be here.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Can you give me a little bit of background about yourself and your history with Linux and open source, free and open source software?
Sure. I am the oldest and least technical editor at Linux Journal. I've known about free software and then later about open source for a very long time. It wasn't part of my life until the early to mid 90s when a friend of mine, Phil Hughes, who had a little company in Seattle called SSC, like Sam Charlie, and who made his living selling kind of these cheater cards for Unix command lines, VI and Emacs and Unix commands and so forth, that mostly sold into the industrial IT Unix marketplace. And he wanted to start a magazine. And so he wanted to actually start a free software magazine. And you've got Richard Stallman coming up as a guest. And Richard was the father of the free software movement, certainly more than anybody else. And I got involved on just kind of an emailing back and forth level with Phil on that. And then out of nowhere, he said, we're going to do a magazine on Linux. And I had never heard of Linux. He said, well, it's this kid in Finland. He invented the first form of Unix that's likely to be widely adopted. And Phil saw that. He saw that was going to happen. This was like in 93, 94. And when Linux hit 1.0 in 94, that's when the first Linux Journal came out. And when Linux began to be used widely as the operating system for web servers on x86 boxes on a very ad hoc way. I mean, this is how Linux spread, was mostly with the web movement. If it weren't for the success of the browser, it's likely Linux would not have had the widespread adoption it had in such a short time. But once that happened, he started a second magazine, Phil Hughes did, called WebSmith, which later became like a supplement with Linux Journal and recruited me as a freelance editor. So I freelanced a bunch of articles into Linux Journal and WebSmith as a contributing editor. In the long run, there were too many other web magazines, and so Phil kind of backed out of WebSmith, and Linux Journal kind of took off. Linux Journal has had a kind of a steady readership. I guess between 50 and 100,000 readers every month, almost for the duration. I mean, we've had a very kind of a steady and loyal base of can-do hackers of various kinds. He hired me full time in, I think it was early 1998 or 99. In 1999, I kind of went from being a contributing editor to a full-time editor, which created a career arc that started in journalism when I was fresh out of college in like 1969, 1970. I did newspaper and magazine work, and then had a long period in there where I worked in radio and I worked in a bunch of other things, and then worked for an advertising and PR agency that for a while was probably the top high-tech agency in Silicon Valley, like from the mid-'80s to the early to mid-'90s. And so I found myself back in journalism and loving it, but with a lot of humility in respect to the technically brilliant people that we were working with, and that were our readers. I mean, our readers are really very technically capable folks, so they wouldn't be reading the magazine. There's code in many of the articles that we have, and what Phil wanted me to do is basically be the business editor. He correctly realized that Linux was going to become pretty much the de facto base level infrastructural building material for lots and lots of businesses, and it would start in the web area as a set of vertical applications. It would probably eventually underlie all of the IT suites of applications that that Unix had been supporting for a long time, Sun's Unix and many other proprietary forms of Unix, and he was right about that. And so I've more or less covered the area where Linux and business meet, and have developed a lot of insights about that, which I've shared in the magazine and in other places. Like I wrote a chapter for the latest open sources book for O'Reilly, and other places. So that's sort of what the long background on it is. I guess it becomes somewhat of an authority on open source at the kind of macro level, not at the technical level, but at the level of what it's good for, how it's being used, and free software too. I want to give free software its props, and they are two overlapping movements that really are symbiotic in a lot of ways. I could just go on talking like that. So
well, no, and I want you to keep talking, and that's the whole goal of the interview. But I'm going to tell you a short story. I read your response to Thomas Friedman's "The World Is Flat." So whenever you originally wrote it, and
right.
Marked it up, put it aside, and then went on over the course of time to develop all of these ideas that I thought were very unique. Well, in preparing for the interview, I went back and reread your response, and I realized you had said a lot of the things that I thought I had been thinking about for the first time.
In respect to school, especially, right? The second essay that I wrote was, I sort of took issue to some degree. My response was kind of a big yes and to Tom's book, which I think was a really important book, rather than a typical review, which says he's right about this, he's wrong about that. And I talked a lot about education, I think, in that, didn't I? I think I did.
You did, and you quoted from a book that's one of my favorites, Gatto's Dumbing Us Down.
Oh, God, yeah. Gatto's the hero of mine. I love Gatto.
Well, and so I'd like to explore that a little bit and to talk about some of the themes there, if it's okay with you, because I think they relate directly to
Sure.
some of the issues associated with free and open source software and Linux in schools. So could you give just a brief synopsis of what Friedman was saying and then how you were responding? Well,
I of course, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I think one of the things that Friedman was saying was that, of course, but by many measures, schools in other countries, especially in Asia and especially in areas like science, are moving ahead of us in the U.S. and they're making better use of technology and so forth. And that we need to catch up, and that the world is flat, meaning that everybody and anybody is in a position to achieve in the connected world. He had a lot to say about open source as well, but where I took some issue was with the notion of IQ. And one of the points that I made was that I was advantaged. I am advantaged today in that I was a terrible student when I was young. For me, school, from the moment I went into kindergarten through most of college, I literally regarded it as prison. I did not want to be there. I was not well adapted to it. I didn't test well. I didn't pay attention. But today they call me an ADD case and give me Ritalin. But in those days, this was the 50s and 60s. Nobody did that. You were just called careless and kind of shoved to the bottom of the heap. And I've always been offended by the notion that anybody, that IQ is a value, that IQ is a fixed value, especially if somebody has an IQ of something. It is absolutely ludicrous. It's puzzle solving, and you get a score out of it. But it's like saying somebody has an IQ of X because they solved a Sudoku puzzle in X amount of time. It's absolutely a ludicrous notion. One of the points that John Taylor Gatto makes is that, and I love this line, he says that his job as a teacher is not to fill the empty head of the child with curriculum, but rather like a sculptor, removing everything that keeps the child's inherent genius from gathering itself. And the notion of genius gathering itself is one that resonates with me, because one of the things I felt when I was a kid, because I was not one of the kids who, when it mattered most, was labeled smart or gifted or anything else like that. As a matter of fact, I was, if my parents had not intervened, I would have been sent to the local vocational technical high school to learn wood shop and auto mechanics and factory work, which which was, what had happened to kids that didn't do well on IQ tests and were not well adapted to school in those days. They're just simply called dumb and shoved aside. And my own IQ scores that I know anyway have a range of 80 points. I mean, do I have an IQ of X? No, nobody does. It's a notion that serves our need to categorize people, and that's what the institution of compulsory education, which Gatto takes on very directly, does. We're processing, as if in factories, large populations of kids, and we have to categorize them. We have to say this one's good at this one's good at that one, this one's bad, this one's good. We're going to call these ones gifted, we're going to call these ones challenged, or whatever other euphemism that we use, and we're going to shove them through the system one way or another that way. And what Gatto says is that, no, all these kids are different. All these kids are good at doing things that only they can do, and that the school system needs to adapt to that. And, of course, he's a big advocate of homeschooling, which has its successes. And I'm with him. I'm with him on almost all of it, because almost everything he writes about resonates with me. And I see it in open source. Now, here's what's so interesting to me about following the successes of open source. Almost everybody I know, including Eric Raymond and a bunch of other folks, is self-taught. A lot of these guys were computer science guys. A lot of them were math whizzes. A lot of them did do well in school, but a lot of them didn't. And a lot of them, were studying something else when they needed some code, when they needed to write something, when or maybe they knew, they learned COBOL, or they learned, one of the code bases that they teach in computer science class, but then they needed to hack a server together. Then they needed to, write some Perl scripts and make a web server run, or whatever it was. These guys, for the most part, are self-taught. And there's a DIY, a do-it-yourself aspect to education that is not respected by the mill system of schooling that we've developed. And that, I think, is demonstrated by the free software and open source movements. Now, it's important to point out that when I started in 1996 or so, there were only a handful of familiar and useful open source building materials. Linux, was one, and then Apache and Perl were another. Later on, other scripting environments like Python came along. Now, if you could just go to SourceForge, it's like 130,000 or so open source projects. And what's happening is that the world is being filled with all of these building materials and all of these tools for building things. And in the course of that, the software industry and the computer industry in general is turning into something very much like the construction industry, from which it borrows a lot of its vocabulary. When we say that we architect and design and build things called sites with addresses and locations that have real estate, and we say they're under construction, and we build code, and we have generations of code we call builds, and we borrow all this language of construction. That actually gives away, to a large degree, the future history of what will become of the software industry, which is that they will have lots and lots and lots of free commodities, or close to free commodities, that grow like trees in the wild. And it's we created this mythical character half a century ago, or more than that, like almost a century ago, called Paul Bunyan. The mythical giant woodsman with his giant ox Blue, who wandered through through Minnesota chopping down trees. Well, one of the reasons that the U.S. grew the way it did in the 19 and the 20th century was that there was this almost free abundance of building material in the form of lumber. And what we've done and then there was also a building method called balloon construction that was invented by a guy named Taylor in Chicago in, I think, 1830 something. that was mocked, and very much the same way as open source was mocked, and free software before that was mocked as being not as good as commercial, not as good as what the fine craftsman made. But you know what? It was real cheap, and it was real easy to do, and you can make anything out of it. And that's the way we've been building everything ever since. And so the history, I think, of the software industry in general is mirroring, in a very remarkable degree, the history of the construction industry. And we're early in it. We're still early in it. You and I were talking before the show a little bit about the trouble that schools have in specifying and then using just open source computing, but many other kinds as well. It's politicized and all the rest of it. But open source isn't that much easier to use, if any easier to use, than Windows. Again, it's still kind of early. We don't have all the building materials we're going to need. We don't have the practices worked out. But we will. In the long run, computing is going to be cheap or free, and the materials we're going to be using are going to be very cheap or free, and it's going to be, and there's going to be a lot of experts around and a lot of them are going to be the kids who are going to figure it out on their own, and they're going to see how to build it, and they're going to take the lead rather than the meandering class of IT professionals that right now are holding wars between the Windows advocates and the Macintosh advocates and the Linux advocates and everybody who wants to sell some kind of courseware into the industrial mill that we call education. Which, by the way, I could just close this long soliloquy with this, is one of the reasons why I actually don't think computers belong in schools until kids bring them there themselves when they're maybe in junior high school. And up to that point, they're a real waste, and it's much more important for kids to learn other stuff. They've got computers at home anyway at this point. It's like bringing a TV to school. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Interesting. I'd like to draw in a couple of threads here from some other things that I've been reading that I think may relate.
Okay.
When I read The Wisdom of Crowds,
mm-hmm.
I was really struck by the sort of scientific approach to showing that just selecting teams based on IQ didn't actually produce the best results.
Right.
And I was reminded of what you had written there. And the idea that there are a great diversity of gifts and there are a lot of ways in which people contribute. So in a collaborative society, brought about by the internet and the open source tools and this ability to work together to build something, it does seem that using IQ as a measure is really not going to help to build that collaborative society.
It is not only not going to help; it's actually appalling. If I were a dictator on it, I would just absolutely forbid it. It is so unbelievably stigmatizing. Sure, if a kid scores really well on an IQ test, he's smart. There's no doubt about it. But if a kid does poorly, that doesn't mean they're dumb. And also, the whole notion of gifts, I think, is wrong. Here's a case in point. Okay, I have two older kids. They're in their mid-30s now. My daughter, perfectly normal kid. We were in North Carolina when she was young. North Carolina did not at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. It was like the mid-70s, early mid-70s. They didn't even have kindergarten yet in North Carolina. North Carolina was like a really backward state that way. We couldn't get her into kindergarten. She could already read. We wanted to get her into something. So we put her in a kind of a sandboxy sort of hippy-dippy school that she was in for a number of years. And so I think she got through the third grade. She got to the fourth grade. She had never had a standardized test. The teacher said, "Oh, my God, we gave her a test. She doesn't do anything on it. She just looks at it, but she's clearly smart. She knows her stuff. We don't know what to do with her." And so we said, "Well, do whatever you want with her, And what happened in the long run is that she actually was a very, very average student. She had straight C's when going into even all through her sophomore year in high school. Then we moved to Palo Alto in California from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. It was a pretty academic place. We got to Palo Alto, and all of a sudden her girlfriends and boyfriends were all really, engaged, smart kids. Their parents teach at Stanford, and some of them, they're Nobel Prize winners in students of HISITs and so forth are showing up here. It's a whole different environment. And I don't know what it was. She also had some teachers that turned her on. But her SAT scores went up about 300 points. She suddenly turned into an almost a straight-A student. She ended up graduating from Berkeley with a Phi Beta Kappa and a nearly a straight-A average. And now she's an assistant professor teaching in the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Okay, so that's in that case, she was never identified as gifted in anything, and she's one of the top theater directors specializing in puppetry right now. And where did that come from? She developed it herself. I mean, it was something that was in her. Some things better or worse. In the meantime, her little brother, this is a kid who taught himself to read and taught himself math by the time he was 4. He could do 4-digit math in his head for fun. He'd add up prices in the grocery store, when he was like 4 or 5 years old. Nothing came hard to him. He totally believed in himself in every way. He was athletic, good-looking, just greased his way in many ways to school. It wasn't that hard for him. Did really well on the IQ test. Did really well on all the others on the other things. Was obviously very gifted at math. Okay, so but they never put him in a gifted class because he was also kind of wild. He just was not well behaved. He was very impulsive, and he liked to jump over chairs and stuff like that. So, and I challenged the school on it. I said, why is this kid who's like aces all your tests not in the gifted program? And they said, well, the last test we gave him was his IQ test, and it only goes up to 140 points, and it's nonverbal and it's verbal. The nonverbal is actually math. He aced that. He got 140 points at that. But he got 103 points. He got 103 in verbal. Well, and they said we averaged 140 to 103 and came up with 122 and a half, whatever it is, and that's below our threshold. And I said, wait a minute, you averaged a known number with an unknown number and came up with a result, and it was completely silly and ludicrous. And so they put him in the gifted program, and only to dissect some frogs, and it didn't really make any difference anyway. But it dealt him into that, sort of like the upper caste that is the GATE program, right? Gets to Palo Alto at the same time his sister's doing better. He does worse. One of the things the school said was, well, he did so poorly in the verbal stuff, he'll never be a writer, right? Well, the long story is he actually did very well in school. And ended up graduating at the University of Indiana University. He went to Santa Cruz, did very well there before that. He's had a very interesting life. He's done a lot of fun, interesting things. But the interesting thing is he actually became quite a good writer. He never did a goddamn thing with math. Math is like, he's probably just as good as anybody else in math right now. But that was how he manifested as gifted when he was age 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. But after that, he ended up he was actually really gifted at basketball and skateboarding and surfing, and not at these other academic pursuits until much later. And I mean, he's written a couple books. I don't think they were ever published, the ones he wrote when he was younger. But and he's working on a book now. And so the point is that there was nothing in the standardized testing that could have even guessed that this kid would be really good at writing and want to do writing and want to do philosophy, which is kind of what his core interest is these days. And now I've got a 9-year-old kid, and I can't even begin to guess what he's going to be good at. It's going to be something he wants to do. It's going to be something that's his inherent genius gathering itself, and there's no curricular approach to that. I can't even imagine a curricular approach to that. I couldn't imagine a curricular approach that would make me what I am now, but doing what I do today. There was nothing in school way back when that would have pointed me in this direction. And to me, that it just kind of comes back to the problem of how do you take the mill and have it support profoundly individual souls.
Right now, I'm thankful for my 7th grade Latin teacher, because as you were talking, I thought, educate, well, that's educare, and that means to draw forth.
Yes.
And even in the root of the word education, there's this wonderful sense of bringing out the best in someone.
Yes, exactly. I had a wonderful conversation with Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly's a publisher of O'Reilly books, and every good programmer, every good techie in computing probably has a shelf full of O'Reilly books, and you can always tell who they are. You're walking through even an office building, and you see there's a shelf full of O'Reilly books in somebody's cubicle. Well, there's a techie in there, and Tim and I were talking one day about the problem that both of us had with conceiving with the notion of information as a commodity. There's this notion that I'm going to deliver information, we're going to consume information, we're going to distribute information. If you look at the roots of information, it's derived from the verb to inform, which in turn is derived from the verb to form. If you tell me something I didn't know before, I'm changed by that. This is something that's profoundly human. This is one of the things that makes us human beings and not more purely instinctual animals. We are enlarged by each other. We are changed by each other. Knowledge is a transformative thing. It's not, informing somebody else is an act of authorship. And so that's one of us said this line: we are all authors of each other. We influence each other, and this, by the way, is profoundly the case in the open source and the free software world. Somebody's code, if it's really good, has an influence on somebody else. Somebody's idea about using that code has an influence on it. It changes other people. It changes the world. What I've acquired in my 50s, and I couldn't have before. I just consider myself saved by the net because, I have the feeling now that if I have a good idea, I can get it going in the world. But I also know that it's not just my idea anymore. A friend of mine is the linguist George Lakoff, and George has become a hero of the Democratic Party because he's the one who figured out that the Republicans really know what to do with language, and the Democrats kind of suck at it, and so he's helping out. And he was down here giving a talk, and a friend of, and we were sitting at the airport, and the plane was late, and we were just talking, and this friend of George's was there, and George said, "Well, Doc here is a big-time blogger." And this guy said, "What's a blog?" And George says, "A pretty good job explaining what a blog is." And then the guy says, "Well, here are all these great democratic causes. You have to fight for racial equality, and you have to get women's rights together, and we have to stop war, and we have to redistribute wealth. There are a whole bunch of democratic causes in it." And they said, "Well, those are really great rocks you could push up a hill, and I like some of those rocks, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, but that's not what I do when I'm blogging. What I do when I'm blogging is I roll snowballs downhill. I have an idea, and I roll them out there, and if they acquire mass, if other people add to them, and they go somewhere, they're not mine anymore. So like with the Clue Train Manifesto, the first thesis there was a line that I had used for years before it was even in the Clue Train Manifesto, but it became a snowball in the Clue Train Manifesto. The line was Markets or Conversations, and look up market conversations now on Google, and you get millions of results. It's a snowball that rolled, and it's not mine. I don't own that. I don't control it. It's not. I feel no sense of no proprietary sense with it. It's rather an idea that I had that I loosed into the world that got rolling and that is meaningful to other people in ways that work for them, and when they use it, it becomes meaningful for other people in ways that work for them, and so on. Any good idea is like that, and that's how I think this is how education really works. I think that's what's the most human thing about education. It's your Latin teacher in the 7th grade. For me, it was a teacher named Pastor Schmidt in the 11th grade. He was the first teacher that recognized that I had some talent at writing, and I really wasn't that good a writer. I was actually a good joker, and I was only experimenting with joking because I wanted to keep up with my roommate, who was a fabulous joker. He was just a really brilliant writer. He was just extremely talented at that, and I didn't think I could ever be as good as he was. But just to keep up with him, I paid a lot of attention to what was funny and what made things funny. And Pastor Schmidt made a point of recognizing in class for the first time in my life at that point that I was good at this one thing, that I wrote some things that he thought were funny and creative. And that made a world of difference to me. And, I mean, that was the first time ever, I think, that I had a teacher flatter me for anything, because I had been such a terrible student up to that point. And that got me going as a writer. I mean, that more than anything else, that one thing, that one teacher made that happen. And I think that's what teachers do. I think good teachers recognize that there's something special in this kid that needs to be encouraged and needs to feed itself and needs to feed on other people and the influence of other writers. And I don't think he did much more than that, quite honestly, but that was enough. That was enough to kind of get me going. And I wouldn't be here now doing whatever it is I'm doing probably if it hadn't been for Pastor Schmidt and later on for a number of other influential people who literally formed me in some way. Anyhow, I'm still blathering on. Are we still on the air?
Yes, and I'm gonna bring it right back to open source.
Okay,
because
good.
One of the things I love about the open source, the free and open source software movements, and in particularly Richard Stallman and the free software movement, is that it really comes out of that same academic tradition of the freedom of sharing.
Yes.
Which is
absolutely.
I've always loved quote books. And I can read a quote and actually feel as though my perspective on life has changed because of someone else's thought that enlightened me in a certain way. And so you can see where, it's very easy to see where the free software movement comes from, this desire to share, in an intellectual, academic, educational setting.
It's not just a desire to share, it's a recognition that this stuff can't be owned. This is one of Richard Stallman's great contributions, I think, I see the free software movement as very much a corollary of what Walt Whitman said somewhere in Leaves of Grass, which is, he said, I could turn and live with the animals. They are so placid and self-contained, not one of them worries about his condition. And he goes on, but one of his lines after that is, not one of them is demented with the mania of owning things. Right. So we've had this notion in education that the curriculum is this body of knowledge, is this body of data that's, that the school kind of owns it and authors of works own it, and it's kind of dumped into the brains of the kids. And what Richard and the free software movement recognized is that this stuff is fundamentally free. This stuff is free as in speech. Speech is free. And knowledge is free, and know-how is free, and it's free as Richard says, it's free as in freedom. You have the freedom to use it any way you want. You have the freedom to change it and to share it and the rest of it. But it recognizes something about the nature of in his case, he was talking about software, but it's actually about the nature of knowledge. It's the nature of that human substance that is, what we know and what we can share of what we know. And that, I think, is to some degree an affront to a lot of what has been conventional in education for a long time, which is that it's not free and that somebody has to own it and copyright is involved and patents and a lot of other stuff like that.
Well, I'm very interested in what's happening right now because this long tail effect, which is just a phrase that we're now using to describe the diversity of opportunities and the abundance of small segmented opportunities. It seems to me that this is going to have a really dramatic impact on how we view education and how we encourage our children. I have some close friends whose son, very academically strong, very good kid, who decided to graduate early, and several of his friends did the same thing. They all sort of took the test and graduated early and have gone on to junior college or college. And I thought, when I was his age, nobody did that. But now, if I look at the world through his eyes, why would you necessarily stay in the high school environment? Because there's this rich abundance of things to learn. There are opportunities. I mean, I knew when I was going through school that I might have to take a job I didn't like, and I was constantly told, you need to learn to write well, and you need to learn to do these things because you're going to be working for somebody else, and they're going to need you to perform well.
Yes.
And so you learn this variety of skills to be able to perform in whatever job you are lucky enough to get.
Right.
And now I look at the world and I think, if I'm interested in some small esoteric thing, I can actually contribute. With the Read Write Web, I can become an historian. I can call Doc Searls and interview him and record it, and all of a sudden I become an interviewer.
Yep.
This is unique. I mean, I have a daughter who's 13, and she's doing a history project on an ancestor. Anne Hutchison, who was considered a witch in her day, is an ancestor from my wife's side of the family. So my daughter's doing a report on her. And I said, hey, let's build a wiki. Let's call some professors who are experts, and let's record their conversations and make it a part of your project. And let's build a wiki, and let's put a resource online where you have actually helped to create an historical resource for Anne Hutchison. Well, that's just amazing to me. And so I think there's something very significant happening here. And what the other, sort of the interesting thread related to this is, it feels very much like kids are going to be bringing this into the schools, a grassroots movement, because it's very hard in the structured environment of schools and their organizations to transform in advance of that.
Yes.
Still very much in the mode of, this is how we do school, where I'm noticing that the kids, they feel very independent of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And it's, I don't know how a kid can go from Wikipedia, just to take one thing, right, to any kind of coursework and not feel like there is so much more equipment available outside the school than in it. And yet, what kids need, and they still need teachers like your seventh grade person. You do need the people. I think the people are really a critical issue, and the curriculum and this awful tradition we really have of educational reform in the country, every one of which consists of increasing the rigidity of standards and enforcing them down on teachers and on schools and test scores and all the rest of that stuff. Sort of flies in the face of that the kids have much more choice now, far more choice about what they can do and what they can learn and where they want to go. I didn't realize, by the way, you could test your way out of high school. That's kind of neat, actually. Because if that had been around when I was there, I would have loved to have done that. That would have motivated me to get the hell out. I mean, I would have gone out of my way to learn a bunch of stuff I didn't know before, just to punch out on that thing. I think that learning as a human system has been around for the duration, and we have this institution. We have these sets of institutions that are educational mills, but they are all staffed by a lot of really good, talented people. I mean, I've always been admiring of the willingness of people to become teachers, which is not a well-paying profession. It's largely thankless. But I actually think it's a high calling. I think it's a very, teachers are the most important resource. You can't really, you can't clone those. They are the rare thing, and the stuff that we call information is not. That's abundant, and the kids can make a lot of that of their own, and they can mash it together, and they can go find it all over the place. But you're still, if you're a math scholar, you're going to need a math teacher. You're going to need somebody who knows more than you do and can help you out. And you can have to go find them if they're not in your school.
The statistic that Larry Cuban uses is that 80% of teachers are very active computer users outside of the classroom, but only 20% really seem to incorporate the computer into their classwork. And you and I talked about this before the show began. They have a lot of expectations. They are trying to help the students. I mean, they're trying to create that personal connection, and they're meeting with parents, and they're teaching classes, and to ask them to be the catalyst for change in bringing computers into the classroom is in many ways asking them to do something they just don't have the time or the ability to do, especially as the computer, whether it's a Linux computer or Windows or a Mac, is still a fairly complex device to keep running and to use. So the question is, and you made an interesting point earlier about not that the computer doesn't need to be brought into schools necessarily till a later date. And Larry makes a very fascinating point, which is, so we're very worried about computers in high school, but if you go to any college campus, everybody's using them quite actively. So somehow they're able to figure them out.
Oh, yeah.
Without necessarily using them in high school. But if the computer can be transformative, if having access to the web, I mean, it's 4 or 5 times a day that I think, I could look that up on Wikipedia.
Right. Exactly.
And that's significant. And although Eric Raymond really doesn't like Wikipedia, I really do.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand its flaws and its weaknesses, but it still provides me with a tremendous amount of information that otherwise isn't necessarily in one place.
Yeah.
So if we accept that that's of real value, if Google Earth is something really interesting in terms of looking at geography and the world, if surfing the web provides you with interesting things, how do we help? Is there something that free and open source software or Linux can do to help make the computer a more integrated part of the educational day?
You know what? I really don't know. I mean, I think it's part of kids' life anyway. I mean, I think it makes sense to have some computers in classrooms where, in the same way as when I was a kid growing up, there would be a bookshelf of Groliers or or the Encyclopedia Britannica or some other thing like that. That you want to have computers in the school for the same reason you want the school to have a library. As for being expert at it, I don't know. I mean, I think the answer would have to be so conditioned on what the course is. If you're studying civics or something like that, I think that there's a lot of stuff on the web. There's always a lot more stuff on the web than there is in any textbook that you can find. But then I think of what John Taylor Gatto did. Part of his genius as a teacher was to take the kids out of the classroom. If he taught them civics, he'd send them down to City Hall and say, he'd even recruit somebody from City Hall to take on the kid as a mentor, to mentor the kid and show them something about how the city worked, or go down and look at this, find out what happens to the sewage. Where does that come from? How do we govern this town? Go figure it out and come back and tell us about it. And be in the real world. And the thing is that, and this is the tough part, and I don't know where to go with this. Actually, I think the net and the web are a real world. I think they are a second world right alongside the one that's physical. And the difference is that in the physical world, we're working with the periodic table, and we're working with the laws of physics, and we're working with distance, and we're working with hard objects and physical limitations of all kinds. And what the web and the net do is they put us all functionally at zero distance from each other. They put us all at zero distance away from the answers to many questions. They put us
So I don't want to take too much more of your time. There were only a couple of other questions I had for you. Can you remember where we were? I completely lost track at that moment because the computer froze.
Oh, boy, I have no idea.
So I'll kind of jump back in. One of the stories that my family always teases me about is that this last year, for the first time, we watched American Idol.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never watched it and didn't know what it was. But we got partway through the season, and I said to my family, I said, this is the new business model. The consumers actually vote to create the end product. Mm-hmm. Then the end product is sold back to those very consumers. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's a very simplified version, and and it doesn't have all the nuances of of the market as a conversation. But it is, in fact, a form of the consumer actually helping to create and pick the product that they are then going to buy, which I think is a part of what you were talking about in the Clue Train Manifesto. Am I close?
You're close, but I would object to the example. To me, what's important is that it isn't about consumption. It's about production. What open source is, and what free software is as well, is an example of the demand side supplying itself. Every open source tool, like Eric Raymond talks about this, that programmers like to scratch their own itches, and those scratches, those scratches turn into code, which then becomes building material for other code and gets used all over the place. And but the point is that it's not about consumption. It's actually about production. And another problem I have with American Idol is because it's still part of the it's one of the ways that the record industry has found to survive, and it's still a pyramid, and it's still a few at the top, and it's based on this notion that there are a few that are graced with just enough talent to get past whoever those assholes are that give withering critiques to everybody and humiliate them, which is what little I've seen on American Idol. It celebrates the humiliation and failure of those that do not rise to the top of that particular system. And I happen to think that one of the things that free software and open source prove is that if you have the goods and you produce the code, I mean, it's almost brutally good in the way that the meritocracy works. And this is something I just observed in the last year watching some Linux kernel hackers talk, and I was on a boat with a bunch of them last fall, about a year ago now, and so I think they did a thing called a geek cruise every year, and I was amazed at how what they say is, show me the code. If you've got the code, great. It's a barn raising. Once an open source project gets going, people show up with the code, they show up with the goods, they show up with the ability to stamp out and correct bugs. As Eric says, more eyes make bugs shallower. And that's a great model for all kinds of things right now. We have this notion that only the very few that are graced with or have earned the privilege of being at the top of some heap or other are qualified to make and run and change the world, and or are good enough to sell a lot of records or sell a lot of product or some other thing like that. And that's not really the way it works. This is another reason why the metaphor of the construction industry is so good. I mean, who is the best builder in the world? Who even cares, right? You pick the person who is really good at doing what they do. You check their reputation. You want them to be able to learn on the job. You want them to hire the best help. You don't want a crew of drunks and misfits who show up on alternate Thursdays. This is, there's a metaphor that's clear to me right now because we're building a house, but it's a meritocracy. Generally we like and reward merit, whatever the merit happens to be. And in the difference with the open source world, though, and the free software world is that, and this is a point I think I was making when we were cut off. It's in the physical world that we know so well. The periodic table is only so large. The number of species is only so large. There are only so many different kinds of minerals and rocks and varieties of wood and the rest of it that we can build with. With code, there is no limit. With human invention, there is no limit. You can make an endless variety of stuff, and you can improve it. And there's a saying that I heard somewhere, and I kind of refined it, but it's called NEA, and it applies to everything that we do in the open source world. It applies to the internet, which is nobody owns it, everybody can use it, and anybody can improve it. Those are the principles on which most all open source coding is done, in which all free software coding is done, even if somebody technically does own it. And even when we do as Eric Raymond would like us to do, and I agree with him on this, is we do want to reward owning property here and there, and we do need to respect the need for people to have that sense of ownership of say their copyrighted works or the goods that they produce. Say it's an embedded Linux product that they own. They own the ideas behind that, and they own whatever it takes to make that. But that's not what it's about. We are enlarging constantly the number and variety of building materials for everything. That's what open source is about. And this is why it's so hard to even say there's a finite body of work there. There's not. It grows all the time. And anybody can jump in and improve it. If somebody finds a better way to do it, they'll do it. One of the things I'm doing right now is I'm trying to fix the part of public safety that notifies people that a fire is coming, right? If you go, there's a giant fire in Southern California right now called the Day Fire. It started on Labor Day. I think that's why they named it that. It's now been going on for almost all of September. And it's like now the fourth or fifth largest fire in the history of California. It's burned 160,000 acres. There are 4,000 firefighters on it. It's still out of control. It's actually fogged up Los Angeles right now. It's a bad thing, and yet the website that collects all the information is called INCIWEB, INCIWEB, has been down since Monday. There is no good single source of information on that. In the meantime, there are lots and lots of individuals, lots of people who can make the bug shallower, lots of eyeballs that can make the bug shallower in the news system, whose publishing can be aggregated somehow. So today I worked with David Sifry of Technorati and a bunch of other individuals on coming up with some web pages that do nothing but aggregate information about the Day Fire, so people can look at it on their BlackBerries, and they can look at it on a dial-up line if they have to. That's what most people up in that area have. Most of them have dial-up lines. There's no DSL or cable up there. And see what's going on, at least see what other people are saying, because the official system is broken down. The official system is like a lot of the educational system, a big mill, and there's a lot of top-down policy-making kind of stuff that goes on and says, no, we have to do it this way and so forth, and it breaks. And you need individuals to come in and say, we're going to raise another barn here, and we're going to do it better, and we're not going to do it inside anybody's system, so we don't have a single point of failure. And that is a value system that is leaking out of it's not so much leaking out, it's an example set by open source development and by free software development that's being adopted by everything else. And it's going to be adopted by education. And I'm not sure it's going to look like a system when we're done with it. It's going to be more like a set of practices and values. So anyway, that's what we're still in the way for you.
Well, so what about Web 2.0? Because a lot of the youth are using those tools like YouTube to create content, but it's missing some of the critical elements of being able to that nobody owns it, and that you can improve it.
I am cynical about the term Web 2.0. I have only half-jokingly called it the name we're going to give to the next crash. I think that there's Ajax and there's Open APIs and a bunch of other stuff like that. But what's happening actually is that there's a gradual realization that there are more and more tools for doing more and more things in the world, and they are coming from individuals and small groups. More and more of them are not commercial. More and more of them are, yet they still support commercial success. They still support commercial activity. There's more and more understanding of principles that have never been that obvious before. For example, there's something I call the because effect. You make money because of something, not with something. This is another huge thing I learned from watching open source development. Google makes money because of Linux. They don't make money with Linux. Same goes with eBay. Same goes with Amazon. Same goes with countless other success stories that have built on really strong, very sturdy infrastructure that essentially costs nothing, but was created because it's very handy to have in the world. That's what Linux is about. Linux is just, it's building material that grows in human nature, and that human nature is the the ability and the willingness to create stuff that's useful to other people. And I think Eric is right in saying that that's not necessarily a moral thing. That is a practical thing. I think it does have moral aspects to it in the sense that, gravity has a moral aspect to it, that we can all kind of count on it, and it's something we all have in common, and we're grateful that it's here, and the rest of it. But there are principles like that we are creating in this new parallel world where there is no distance and where anybody can come and add value to anything else in a way that's not a chain. The old system was a value chain. Even the notion of education, the matriculation process by which you move from kindergarten through college, as if you were, a pie moving down a conveyor belt that gets the crust first and then the blueberries and then gets cooked and then you add some topping, and that's sort of the way we've conceived education. It's is born in the industrial age, and as Gatto pointed out, it serves as this almost industrial purpose of preparing us for the industrial world where we're going to work for other people. Well, what open source has taught us and free software has taught us is we can work for ourselves, and the work that we do, the code that we make may not be how we make money, but we will make more money because of it than we'll make with it. And that's a kind of a little jujitsu we can put on things, but it can prove, very, very remunerative once we relieve ourselves of the notion that every single thing we do has to make money.
I think we've reached a good stopping point. Doc, thanks for taking the time. That was fascinating.
Well, thank you.
And aside from recording it, I've made lots of notes, and maybe there'll have to be a part 2 at some point, just because I think you've raised some issues which are so interesting and compelling. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.